Hello, my name is Jonathan Lowell. I am the Engagements and Programs Coordinator for Planet Texas 2050, a research initiative at the University of Texas with the goal of being of service towards making the state of Texas and beyond more resilient. We do this by undertaking interdisciplinary research that aims to make a societal impact. As part of that project, we started this series, which we've called Resilience Roundtables, to bring together leaders across the academic, nonprofit, government, advocacy, and artistic sectors. And for this academic year, we are exploring the theme of academic community partnerships for adaptation and resilience, where we will hear case studies both nationally and internationally, detailing the ways in which academics work with various community partners to build and maintain fruitful relationships and provide actionable research towards making communities more resilient. And for this, our fourth and final in this year's series, we will hear from Brianna Shea and Dan Gillis from the Iowa Flood Center, which is the nation's only academic research center devoted solely to flooding that puts science-based information in the hands of Iowa's decision makers, lawmakers, state and federal agencies, emergency responders, and the public. And before we begin, I'd like to read the land acknowledgement that was developed by the program in Native American and Indigenous Studies here at UT. We would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. And moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Cusara, Caddo, Carrizo Comecrudo, Coyahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. And in recognition of the ongoing and cumulative challenges faced by Indigenous peoples in Central Texas and globally, we call upon the University of Texas at Austin to repatriate the ancestral remains held by the Texas Archaeological Research Lab to their Indigenous descendant communities, to support the transition of the program in Native American and Indigenous Studies into a center, and to establish a protocol of research and study on tribal and native lands, and to foster an ethics and practice of engaged scholarship with and for Indigenous peoples and communities, locally and internationally. So to introduce our speakers for today, we have Daniel Gillis, who is the Water Resources Engineer for the Iowa Flood Center with a special interest in ecohydraulics. He develops flood models to simulate how flooding occurs in communities with the ultimate goal of creating the capacity for communities to evaluate and reduce flood risk. Daniel is also involved in the Iowa Watershed Approach project, where he develops digital watershed models that simulate how rainfall is transformed into stream flow. He has an MS in hydroscience and engineering from the University of Iowa and a BS in civil and environmental engineering, also from the University of Iowa. And Brianna Shea is the program manager for communications and outreach for the Iowa Flood Center. She develops and implements communications and outreach programs for IFC projects. This includes serving as an effective and knowledgeable liaison between the Iowa Flood Center staff and external stakeholders, including agency personnel, policymakers, community leaders, and the general public. She has an MA in strategic communication from the University of Iowa and a BS in animal ecology from Iowa State University. And with that, I will turn it over to Brianna.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just pull up my slides here and then we'll get started. Okay, can I get a confirmation that those look okay?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to meet with everybody that's able to join us today. And thanks for that introduction again, Jonathan. A little bit more about my background. I kind of use my background in natural resources and then communications to advance and maintain relationships with different communities, and both working with local and state and federal agency partners to kind of advance the work of the Flood Center. So today our presentation is going to be split in two. I'm going to focus a little bit more on just some of the programmatic elements of the Flood Center, and then I'll turn it over to Dan, and he can talk a little bit more about some of the more technical aspects of some of the modeling work and some of the watershed-based work that we've done across the state. So a little bit of introduction about kind of the home of the Flood Center and how we got started. We're actually part of a larger organization called IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering, that's part of the College of Engineering at the University of Iowa. And IIHR has actually been around since about 1920. So we have more than 100 years of expertise kind of solving all things related to water and fluids related research. So we have students and staff and faculty that work together on these different challenges. And our first about 80, 90 years, really focused on working all across the globe on different projects. And kind of since the creation of the Flood Center, then another one of our organizations, the Iowa Geological Survey, we've become much more kind of state focused and had a much larger state presence. But some of the projects that we have and some of the disciplines that we work in at IIHR is we have a well-renowned ship hydrodynamics program. So the image, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but of the ship in the water, that's at one of our wave basin facilities out at our Oakdale campus, one of the largest wave basin facilities in the country where we do ship hydrodynamics research. So studying ships for their seaworthiness and maneuverability, and working with the Navy to kind of make improvements to a lot of those capabilities. And then we also have a large physical modeling based research expertise within IIHR. So some of you might be familiar with some of the flooding that has occurred in Ellicott City within the last couple years. So they experienced two 1,000-year flood events, one in 2016 and then just 2 years later in 2018. And it is heavily dependent on tourism for the economy there. You can kind of see the image of how fast and destructive that flood event was from the image that's playing or the video that's playing there. And so we were contracted with them to develop and evaluate two different unique drop shaft structures that they were going to place in the city that would capture some of this rainfall runoff and divert it through a large underground tunnel underneath the city that would bypass some of the most vulnerable areas for some of these flood events. And the modifications and the work that we did through that project were able to save them about $4 to $5 million in construction costs. So this is kind of a unique part of our program too. And we've done work like this for other cities all across the world, from London to Abu Dhabi, working in DC and other large communities across the country. But really what today's presentation is going to focus on is the work of the Flood Center and how we got established. And so this is kind of the hallmark flood event that created the Iowa Flood Center. This is an image of the 2008 floods that impacted Cedar Rapids, so a large area just about 30 minutes north of where we are in Iowa City. So more than 20,000 people were evacuated during this event. And at the time, it was the FEMA's 5th largest natural disaster event on record. And so this really changed the way that we did flood related work across the state of Iowa and led to the creation of the Flood Center. So we had a couple of state legislators that reached out to some of our professors within IIHR, knowing that we already had this rich program in water resources that would be the perfect home for establishing a center like the Iowa Flood Center. So we are the nation's only academic research center that's currently focused on doing just flood related research. And this is the bill or the language that we really guide all of our programs and all of our efforts at the Flood Center. And so we were tasked by our legislators to develop a real-time flood forecast system for the state of Iowa, and to develop different floodplain inundation maps across the state, to establish different community-based programs to improve flood monitoring and prediction, to share resources and expertise. And we do that a lot through our outreach and community engagement work. And then to develop the future workforce in the state and across the Midwest and other locations. And we do that through working with different students that are actively involved in our research and kind of enhancing the capabilities of our programs. So we formally got established in 2009, and then we quickly got to work putting together different tools and projects and resources to help Iowans just be better informed about their flood risks and help protect communities from future flooding, because that was really what we learned from the 2008 floods, is that people just didn't really understand the magnitude of the flooding that was going to happen to them. And it wasn't just Cedar Rapids, it was much of eastern Iowa that was impacted by that event. And we've also had flood events kind of every year since the 2008 floods. We share a lot of the information that we have through a publicly accessible Iowa Flood Information System online platform. So I'll take some time kind of going through some of the capabilities of that system. We currently get our state funding at about 1.25 million a year. That's remained pretty stagnant since our establishment in 2009. It hasn't changed much. At one time we were up to 1.5 million, but in 2017 we went back down to 1.2 million. And then we leverage that base funding to bring in other federal grants and contracts. So we've been able to be a really good investment for the state and being able to leverage that state funding that we received to bring in about $200 million in external funding to Iowa to improve flood resilience research. So we'll talk more about some of those projects and initiatives. One of our hallmark things that we've done across the state is to deploy a dense network of these stream gauge systems on smaller streams and tributaries across Iowa. So working with the different partners that you see at the bottom there. And these tend to support the U.S. Geological Survey stream gauge network, and they're very robust and they're self-contained. So they operate on the solar panel here. And then we use this ultrasonic transducer that collects the air between the side of the bridge and the river network or the river levels. And then that gets communicated via a cell modem to our online servers where it's ultimately displayed on that Iowa Flood Information System platform. So this is extremely valuable for our emergency management professionals and other community members, decision makers, as well as different agency personnel that are working with communities when we have active flood events going on across the state. We've had some of these that have been in the field that we haven't had to do any type of maintenance that have remained untouched for 10 plus years. But we're kind of coming up at a critical point within the flood center where a lot of these have kind of are exceeding the technology that they were originally designed for, combined with a lot of the weather extremes that we've been experiencing. So we're kind of looking at what the next generation of stream sensors might look like across the state. This map shows an outline of the state of Iowa and the locations where we have some of these stream gauges. So the blue ones represent where we have the Iowa Flood Center stream gauges. We've got 270 of those, and then the green ones are the U.S. Geological Surveys. So you can see that theirs tend to be on some of the larger streams and rivers, and then ours are really just complementing and enhancing their network. And ours are also just looking at the water level. We're not collecting discharge or any other information with our network. But it tends to be a much more cost-effective solution for certain communities that might be looking to implement these themselves or pay for them themselves, and has worked really well for our purposes too. So Iowa, just a little bit about kind of our landscape and where we are. I think we're just about a quarter of the size of Texas too, so it makes it a little bit easier for us to be able to maintain and manage this type of network. We are largely agriculturally dominated, and we have a lot of artificial drainage across the state too. And that combined with just our location where we're really prone to different flood conditions makes us one of the most inland flood impacted states of anywhere across the country. If you were to click on any one of those blue IFC gauges, this is what you would be able to access from that. So we try to make IFIS really user-friendly, try to put things in kind of an interactive visualization system to make it more of a public-facing system. So that was another thing that we learned from 2008 was that people were having to go to multiple different platforms and visit online tools to be able to access information. So we really try to make IFIS this one-stop shop for flood information that people can go to. The dark blue area that you see from the slider on the bottom, you'd be able to use this if you were in real time and go back and see what the river level has done over the last week and a half. And then the light blue area is really what's critical for our emergency management professionals and community leaders and decision makers, as well as individuals to access when we have active flooding going on. So that shows them the flood forecast and allows them to take proactive measures to protect themselves or communities or land and things like that that might be impacted by an event. In addition to the stream gauge network that we have, we also have a hydrologic weather station network deployed across the state. We call these hydro stations, and they measure precipitation from these two elements up at the top. They, similar to our stream gauge platforms, they operate by a solar panel, and then we use cell modem technologies to collect the data and send it to our online systems. And then we're also collecting soil moisture and soil temperature data with these stations, as well as we have a groundwater well, so we're measuring groundwater levels at these sites. And so this has been an initiative of the Flood Centers pretty much since its establishment to try to get one of these stations deployed in every county throughout the state to improve not only our flood forecasting and monitoring, but also drought. So that's kind of the other weather extreme that we face in Iowa. And so we've been successful within the last couple of years on getting some federal community project funding, working closely with our federal delegation in districts 1 and 2 to get support to put one of these in every county in eastern Iowa. So if you look on the map there, those gold counties are where we currently have one of these deployed. You'll see that we do have some in the western side of the state too, and that was from a watershed-based project that we'll talk more about. We expect to receive some other federal funding, fingers crossed, in the dark gray counties there in the southwest Iowa. And then we're working to identify some funding sources for Northwest Iowa. So trying to be creative in how we can continue to build on this network. And we're already seeing good results from the information that it's providing us and how it's informing and enhancing our forecast model at the Flood Center. In addition to having the stream gauges that we have deployed across the state, we provide flood alerts and forecasts for more than 1,000 different Iowa River communities. So it was important to us since our establishment to make sure that we were serving a lot of our rural communities across the state too that might not have access to a sensor right in their community, but wanted to give them some type of flood information that they could have access to. And so we harvest a lot of hydrologic and meteorological data, as I mentioned, from other different state agencies and partners. And then in addition to our own flood monitoring network, that informs this hill slope link model that we've developed for the state of Iowa, where we can provide these different flood alerts and forecasts. We've done a lot of different flood mapping initiatives for the state. So shortly after we were established with some of the disaster recovery funds from 2008, we had a large initiative working with Iowa DNR and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to remap all 99 counties across the state. And so we developed updated floodplain maps for the 2, the 5, the 10, the 25, the 50, the 100, the 200, and the 500 different flood inundation levels. And we provided kind of that spectrum of flood risk just to be able to help communities have a better idea of what those flood risks were like and help them make better informed decisions about where to place, critical infrastructure, emergency facilities, schools, medical facilities, and things like that. And so we have those available through IFAS, and the DNR has been working kind of going through that process to make those FEMA regulatory flood maps. And then in addition to those county-based flood maps, we also have scenario-based flood inundation maps that we've developed for about 30 communities across the state that we continue to kind of build on and add to every year. Try to get to about 2 or 3 communities every year to expand on those, but kind of focused on some of the larger communities across the state to begin with. And now we work with communities on kind of a first come, first serve basis to create these maps. But this was another thing that was really hard for communities like Cedar Rapids to understand during the 2008 floods was they knew from referencing their local USGS gauge, or in this case, we're showing an Iowa Flood Center gauge, what the predicted flood stage was going to be, but they couldn't put that into context of where the water was going to go and which areas were going to be impacted. So these scenario-based maps are really helpful for communities and kind of right there along with our stream gauges. This is a very popular tool for communities to have access to across the state. All of the things that I've showed so far are available again through this online system called the Iowa Flood Information System. If you go there, Google it, it should come right up, and there's a few different shortcut tools that you can get to at the bottom here that are some of the most popular features, or you can just go into the general launch IFAS button and see any active flood alerts that would be going on. Right now it's pretty quiet, so we don't have a lot of information showing there, but this is how you would get to that system. In 2016, the city of Cedar Rapids was preparing for their second highest flood crest of record. So just less than 10 years after the 2008 flood. So people, still remembered that event. And there was, I think, a lot of anxiety about kind of what the magnitude and what the extent of this flood event was going to be. But people were a lot more prepared. And so this is an image of kind of one of our local news media channels that was pulling up our flood information system platform and accessing those scenario-based inundation maps that we had for Cedar Rapids. And this drew so much attention that we had over 150,000 users that were trying to access IFAS within a week's time period, that it actually crashed our system temporarily. So we were able to get everything back up online so that people could have access to that information. But it was a good example of kind of how people were able to have better tools and resources to prepare for that event. And the city of Cedar Rapids themselves used this to deploy PESCO barriers and put up sandbags and do a lot of efforts to try to mitigate the damages from this event that they just didn't have access to in 2008. I specifically work with a small team on a lot of our outreach and communications efforts and just engagement, finding new partnerships and maintaining partnerships across the state. So we do that through a variety of different ways. We do that by going to K through 12 events and doing different teacher trainings. We do a lot of different community and public events where we're meeting with communities that maybe have been impacted by floods and trying to provide them with support or ways that we can provide technical assistance to help them as they kind of move forward. We're active in a lot of different conferences where there are a lot of local leaders and elected officials that participate in. So we either have a booth or we have some type of presentation so that we can get in front of those groups, because particularly those audiences are the ones where there's a lot of turnover. And so that outreach and education piece never goes away. We always need to be interfacing with those different partners. We host a lot of visitors that want to come here and kind of learn about the work that we've done. So always happy to kind of share. And that's, I think, the purpose of some of what we're doing today, is to just share what we've developed and allow others to kind of learn from some of the things that we've done. And then we do a lot of legislative outreach and engagement. So I mentioned that we get our base funding from the state. And so it's really important to us to maintain those relationships with our legislators, make sure that they know how that we're using those state taxpayer dollars and how that investment is kind of serving the people of Iowa. This is just some news headlines from other states that have come and visited us. We did have a group from Texas that came in 2020 in January. And I remember our group being really impressed that they wanted to come to Iowa in January. I think it was like 15-degree wind chill when they visited here. But we had a really good exchange with the folks that came and just sharing kind of the work that we've done and kind of learning about some of the initiatives that they were working on too. So enjoyed that visit. I mentioned that kind of alternated by the flooding that we have in the state, it seems like we have drought that almost immediately follows. And this is becoming challenging because people have short flood memories, and when we have these drought conditions, I think people are not expecting or are not as prepared for when we have these flood events that kind of come up on us. And so this was evident from just last summer in Northwest Iowa. We had a 3-year drought, and then it seemed like almost overnight they went to record-breaking, devastating flooding in this part of the state. So in less than 3 days, really, some areas had received between 15 and 18 inches of rain. Many of the communities up there, it was categorized as a 5,000-year flood event for them. And so they were just completely unprepared. There just wasn't a lot of good information about kind of the specificity, the timing, and the magnitude of some of those flood events. And so these more flashier flood events are kind of becoming what we're trying to be better prepared for across the state through some of the work that we're doing right now. So this is an image of Spencer, Iowa, one of the communities that was impacted by that event. They had about 80% of their community that was impacted, so homes and businesses that were damaged by that flood event. And I think there were also close to 500 people that had to be rescued by boat or even helicopter during these flood events because of how quickly it happened, and people woke up in the middle of the night with a couple feet of water on the main levels of their homes. So it was just really devastating for them. And it was really eye-opening for us too, because we learned through this process, after we reached out to some of those communities to ask them, what resources could we provide, what support we could provide, that they were actually unaware of some of the tools and the resources that we had. So being completely transparent with this group, as much as we are proud of the outreach work and the education work that we do across the state, there's always more need for that. And that was really evident by this event. So we worked with them on developing a community public meeting. So there was a lot of, I think, people that were looking at somebody to blame during this event too, as a lot of times there are. And so we worked with the city manager and the mayor and different other partners that were involved in the flood response efforts of that event. and put on this meeting where we had close to 200 people that came out in person and another 100 that joined virtually to kind of learn about the series of events that led up to the flooding and learned about the city's kind of actions and the steps that they took. And then we came in and provided just some of those resources that I've shared with you all, as well as identified some projects and key things that we could provide moving forward to try to at least, show that we were collaborating and let them know that there were efforts that were happening to try to prevent this type of damage from happening again in their community. So we do a lot of this type of work. Dan and others from our team just recently got back from a trip with meeting with some other communities up in Northwest Iowa a couple weeks ago too. We do have a new faculty member that's joined our team that really specializes in flash flood forecasting. And so he was part of the team that worked to develop the flash flood forecast model that's used operationally by the National Weather Service. And he joined our program about a year and a half ago now. And so he's really focusing on how can we use what's already available here within Iowa to improve that flash flood forecasting. So looking at kind of what happened with the Northwest Iowa floods as an example or a case study that he's kind of beginning this work. And Iowa, we're just at this really good location where we have this cold air from the north and warm air from the Gulf that causes these mesoscale convective systems that are the precursor for flash floods. So we're kind of right at the bullseye for flash floods, and that's kind of what this image is showing here on the map. This is my last slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dan. So this is just an introduction to a large watershed-based project that we've had across the state of Iowa. So we've received 2 rounds of funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, really beginning our watershed-based projects back in 2010, working in those watersheds that you see on the map there in red. So we worked to develop different hydrologic assessments for these different watersheds and then identified one sub-watershed to really focus on how could we go in and implement different conservation practices like ponds or terraces and wetlands and figure out how many of those we would need to have a measurable benefit on reducing flood risks. And we had some really promising results from that initial kind of pilot study. And so we were able to receive a second round of HUD funding beginning in 2016, where we received $97 million from the state of Iowa to really just scale up this program. And so those are the watersheds that we worked with in blue. So through that program, we invested about $40 million just in those nature-based conservation practices. Again, we did the hydrologic assessment in those watersheds. And then after the projects went in, we completed a project evaluation, again, looking at those actual benefits. And one of the unique parts of this program is that we worked with what are called watershed management authorities in the state of Iowa. So these WMAs are made up of city and county and soil and water conservation district representatives. And so we really wanted to try to empower local leaders and decision makers to work together to set their watershed goals and priorities, knowing that these people know their watersheds better than we do, and really wanted, again, to kind of have them at the table and have them be leading a lot of these efforts. So we kind of really served as a consultant almost in this project and helping just inform the decisions that they were making on the ground. So I think with that, I'll stop sharing, and then Dan is going to take over, and then we'll table any questions for the end here.
Thanks, Bree. See. Okay. Hopefully my slides are looking okay where Bree left off. Thank you. Yeah, so a really great introduction there by Bree on the Iowa Watershed projects and Iowa Watershed Approach programs. So really the inspiration for those types of watershed projects came from the Soap Creek watershed group. You can see Soap Creek in this map on the top. So it's a pretty small watershed, around 250 square miles in south central Iowa. So that group is pretty unique in that they started in 1986 with the formation of their watershed group, and they signed that 28E agreement that kind of unites the different political entities, counties, municipalities, soil and water districts, and enabling them to work across those political boundaries. And so this Soap Creek Watershed Group they conducted a study in 1988 that identified 154 project locations that they could implement within their 250 square mile watershed. So most of these projects were, kind of farm ponds and other detention pond projects that were mostly located in the upland areas. And they found, of that 154 projects that were identified in 2012, they had built 132 of those. And we worked with them to do a study of what sort of peak flow reductions those projects were providing across the watershed. And through our modeling effort, we found that there were significant peak flow reductions provided because of those. And, one unique thing about this approach is that they're fairly small projects, some large, but mostly small, and they're constructed in upland areas where, you can construct these smaller structures and not have, large high hazard class structures on the main rivers that would, pose another hazard if they were to fail. Shown on the right here, this is Jerry Parker. So he's one of the original founding members of that watershed group. And you can see on Jerry's shirt there, we can't all live upstream. So, that's kind of the feeling that they went into how they did their work. So that inspiration led to the Iowa Watershed Approach program that Brianna had introduced. So the idea is to establish a watershed management authority, and then our role in that after that was to develop a hydrologic assessment of each of those 8, Huck 8, Huck 10 watershed size group or watershed areas. We deployed our monitoring equipment, those hydro stations, river stage sensors, and then we worked with the watershed coordinators and their work with the landowners to implement projects. So they were a very important part of the project, was having these landowners willing to participate. And then, of course, we ended up building projects that reduced flood risk and improved water quality downstream. And then, of course, like Brianna mentioned, one important part of that was assessing the project benefit of those, shovel and dirt projects based on monitoring and modeling data. So the Iowa Watershed Approach hydrologic assessments, consist of a few components, being the, just kind of a review of Iowa's flood hydrology and watershed or water quality across the state. And then, of course, at each one of those individual IWA watersheds, we looked at hydrologic conditions, geology and soils, topography, terrain, land use, historical data records or instrumentation on any of the rivers and streams within the watershed. Another kind of neat resource we have in the state of Iowa is we have a database of existing best management practices that have been constructed on Iowa lands. So those are, mostly kind of agricultural conservation practices. So things like terraces, water and sediment control basins, ponds, grass waterways. And, we could also make use of a tool called the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework tool. So that GIS tool utilizes a bunch of GIS layers to kind of pinpoint locations where different conservation practices would be well suited to be constructed. So that was another part of the hydrologic assessment, was looking at what's already been built out there versus what could be built in terms of BMPs. And then a really big part of the hydrologic assessment was the hydrologic model. So we use that to understand kind of how the hydrology in the watersheds is characterized, and then also to run different what if watershed scenarios. So, for example, what if we converted all of the row crop agriculture to tall grass prairie, or converted or utilize cover crop no-till farming practices on all of the row crop area, or also, build a distributed network of ponds or wetlands within our watershed. So a really neat innovative tool that we developed here at the flood center was a GHOST program. So GHOST stands for Generic Hydrologic Overland Subsurface Toolkit, GHOST. So that was based off of the PIM, the Penn State hydrologic model, but we kind of really built off of that, made it our own. The idea behind it is that it's a physically based, continuous, distributed model. So it's trying to model all of the different processes of the water cycle. So, of course, precipitation, evaporation, transpiration, infiltration. It takes in solar radiation as a forcing data set, and it's pretty unique piece of software. It treats the ground soil column in kind of 3 zones. There's a surface zone, unsaturated soil zone, and then groundwater area. And the water table is represented as a moving interface. Also, another unique feature within GHOST is it has a tile drainage module where we can see how, we have all this drainage tile that's been installed in much of Iowa, and that has a significant effect on the water table and how runoff develops. A lot of that infiltrated water, it gets kind of short-circuited into streams via base flow. So that's really good component to have in GHOST. Overland flow is modeled with a 2D diffusive wave approximation, and then all of the perennial streams are modeled with a 1D model for water depth throughout the streams. And this program uses a finite volume formulation, and we typically had to run this program on our high performance computing cluster that we have available at the University of Iowa. So it runs fairly fast, depends on how many nodes and mesh elements your model has, but typically you'd run around 20 years of record over the course of like 1 day of computing time. So pretty fast turnaround. So some of the things we looked at when we start building our models, we need to calibrate and validate it. So this slide shows some of the examples of different statistical analysis that we conduct to ensure our model is producing reliable results. So very typical NSE, percent bias, R squared values. We would have a calibration period for this particular model. It's showing the Wapsipinicon river watershed. So we'd have a calibration period that went from 2002 through 2011, and then a validation period of 2011 through 2018. And of course, we'd look at different peak flow events during those 2 calibration validation periods, total runoff depth volume, and compare those to any observations that were available within the watershed. And then once we were, kind of satisfied that our GHOST model was behaving correctly, we could get into some of the more interesting watershed what-if scenarios. So one thing we like to look at is conversion of cropland to native vegetation. Use that as a baseline. So much of Iowa, pretty much everything that is currently farmed used to be prairie at one time. You can see that in the figure on the right-hand side. So all of that gold area that was once prairie is now row crop, basically agricultural fields. And then some of it along the river corridors were, woodlands or brush. So we like to think of, if you converted all that cropland to native vegetation, we like to think of that as being like the healthiest the watershed might be. It would, infiltrate and transpire, the largest amounts of rainfall. So one way we parameterize that conversion is we change the leaf area index time series for all of our mesh elements. We changed the root depth. So, native vegetation has its root depth extended for much deeper and much longer over the course of a year compared to row crop agriculture. And then also, just kind of crop coefficients, how active are the crops? Typically, native vegetation will have a much longer active period of, evaporating water and transpiring water. Another thing we look at is, broad long-term utilization of cover crops and no-till. So if you're not familiar with cover crops, basically you might have a main crop like corn or soybean, but during the winter months you can seed and plant a winter crop. So things like winter rye or winter wheat, uh, and those crops will grow during the winter months, and their root structure will be in place, during like spring rainfall events. So it'll hold all the soil in place. The root structure that stays there due to the no-till farming practice will stay in place and keep infiltrating water during wet periods, and it'll kind of dry out the soil really while it's growing in those winter months and spring months. Another thing we look at is of course, a distributed network of small detention ponds. So we'll go in and within our model have a storage volume and then assign some outflow characteristic that allows it to take advantage of that pond storage. So kind of give you a quick summary of our typical peak flow reduction percentages. Just want to kind of show you the light green color for now. So with those 100% conversion of row crop agriculture to native vegetation, we might typically expect somewhere around a 50% reduction in peak flows. For cover crop no-till practices, we might expect around a 20% reduction. And then in this case, for that Wapsipinicon River watershed, we had implemented around 900 detention ponds across the watershed, and that resulted in around a 5% reduction in peak flows at the outlet of that watershed. So in addition to this, those kind of base scenarios, we wanted to look at what was the effect of increased precipitation. So what we did was for the wettest 5% of rainy days, we took the hourly precipitation and increased that by 10%. So that's based off of the climate science special report that came out in 2017, looking at kind of mid-century, what you'd expect for increase in daily 20-year extreme precipitation. And that is for the lower emissions scenario. So just 10%. So if you go back to this figure and look at the black bars, just for kind of our baseline scenario, when you account for increased precipitation, you're actually going to have an increase of nearly 15% in peak flows. So it kind of puts things into perspective. Even with all those 900 ponds that were, hypothetical ponds that were constructed within that watershed, you'd still expect around a 10% increase in peak flows, even though we had all those ponds built, but just kind of increased precipitation. That's what that would do. And then cover crops, of course, are also reduced. You'd still have a 10% reduction in peak flow and then around a 40% reduction in with the native vegetation in place. So like Rita mentioned, a big part of the Iowa watershed approach was getting practices constructed in eligible areas. So due to where the money was coming from, there were very specific areas within each watershed that we could actually build these projects. And each one of those that could be built within those areas, landowners were offered a 90 to 100% cost share. And, across all 8 IWA watersheds, we had over 700 flood mitigation projects constructed. Eligible practices included wetlands, ponds, terraces, floodplain restoration, channel bank stabilization, buffer strips, saturated buffers, just perennial cover, oxbow restoration, bioreactors. If you're not familiar with those, basically it's like a wood chip kind of bank filled in at the downstream end of field tile. So it'll treat the field tile and remove nitrates from that. that field tile water, and then prairie buffer strips. So this particular project I'm showing here, this is the Albert wetland. So it was constructed in the Middle Cedar watershed. It has a drainage area of around 112 acres and the pool, a permanent pool of around 8.5 acres. And it was constructed at a cost of around $150,000. This is another example in the Middle Cedar watershed. It's the Jellison wetland, so it has a drainage area of around 1,300 acres and a permanent pool area of around 13 acres, and it was constructed at a cost of $633,000. So, like I had mentioned before, there are only certain sub-watersheds where these practices could be constructed. So in this example, this is the upper Wapsipinicon River. You can see the 4 Huck 12 watersheds, sub-watersheds highlighted there. These were the only areas where we could build these practices. So they had 28 total practices built. And those were, within some of these Huck 12s, these are kind of what I call, I guess, pass-through Huck 12. So they have a lot of drainage area upstream that's coming through the Huck 12. I'll get to that in a minute. So we used the GHOST model to evaluate what sort of effect these built projects had. So zooming in on a couple of those practices, you can see those red dots. Those are where 2 pond projects were built. So Upper Wapsie 11 and Upper Wapsie 23 ponds. So we're going to look at the effect of those as we move downstream. So just below the project is where we typically expect the largest peak flow reductions. So for that pond 11, it was around 85% reduction for this particular event. Below pond 23, it was around a 41% reduction in peak flow. Now, as we move further downstream, we have more drainage area entering the stream, and it's kind of untreated. It's not passing through these projects. So it's a little bit more difficult to reduce the peak flow. You can see the peak flow here downstream was reduced only 32%. As we move further downstream, where there's even more kind of untreated flow along this stream, that peak flow reduction decreases to 6%. So this is, I guess, kind of a challenge with these built projects, is you'd expect to make, really big peak flow reductions just downstream, but as you add more kind of untreated drainage area, it's more and more difficult to make peak flow reductions at the outlets. So that's kind of why that Soap Creek watershed had so many projects built to get that kind of level of peak flow reduction. So just kind of summarize, at the downstream end of this particular tributary, with those practices, you might only expect like a 3/10 of a foot difference in stage for that particular event. So there's, I guess, the challenge of kind of capturing enough drainage area, having enough pond storage to treat the runoff. There's also kind of a challenge with timing. So this is another Huck 12 watershed in it's the East Nishnabotna River watershed, and Mill Creek, which is the Huck 12 sub-watershed. So there are also 2 ponds built within that sub-watershed that I'm showing here with the red dots. And then starting upstream of those projects at point A, we see a 0% reduction in peak flow, unsurprisingly, because there's no projects there. As we look at just downstream of each pond at location B and C, we see really sizable peak flow reductions of around 90%. But moving further downstream to point D, where there's a lot more untreated drainage area that's entered the stream, and there's different timing elements going on, we can see the peak flow reductions from those 2 projects kind of only occurs on the rising limb. So at the peak of the event at location D, there's, no peak flow reduction for that event. So it's just kind of one of the challenges with these built projects. So the project storage available, because of the IWA project, it's making big differences just downstream of the project, but on the watershed scale, it's really hard to make an effect at the outlet. So total project storage for the upper Wapsipinicon River, installed as part of the IWA project, was 413 acre feet of pond storage over those 28 practices. And it's capturing a drainage area of 4,239 acres. So just for an example, the 2008 flooding event at Anamosa in the upper Wapsipinicon River watershed had a flood volume of over 600,000 acre feet. And with those IWA projects, the peak flow reduction would have only been less than 0.1% of that 2008 flood peak. So if you recall, we were talking about phase 1 of the IWA project. As part of that, we incorporated over 900 ponds in the GHOST model, and that resulted in a 5% average peak reduction at Anamosa. So, a question we wanted to ask ourselves was, what would it take to get a 10% reduction in the 2008 flood peak at Anamosa? And kind of extrapolating, we thought it would take over 4,000 pond projects at an investment of $265 million. So just kind of putting things into perspective, with the built projects, you need a lot of investment, and along with that, we also need kind of broad scale changes in agriculture to really affect big differences at downstream locations. So things like using cover crops and no-till, or as much perennial cover as we can. I'm going to shift now and talk about our Missouri River flood information system. So in March 2019, parts of Nebraska and South Dakota experienced a bomb cyclone. So this was a big rainfall event that came through during March, where there was frozen ground and snow, quite a bit of snowpack. So in some areas, it was over 3 inches of rainfall, landing on snow water equivalents of around 6 inches. So in many places, you had 3 inches of rainfall falling, melted snow, none of it infiltrated because the ground was frozen. So it was huge amounts of runoff. So, as a result of that, communities like Hamburg, which are along the Missouri River, they were, devastated. There were other communities like Pacific Junction that were also really devastated. Many homes and businesses, they had floodwaters up to the eaves of many of their buildings. So the Flood Center was part of an effort to develop a Missouri River flood information system. It was really neat project for us, where we could bring together a lot of our hydrologic modeling, our hydraulic modeling, which I'm showing here. This is an example of a simulation of a levee breach along the Missouri River near Hamburg. So you can see kind of this is what some of the tools that we had available to us that were incorporated into the Missouri River flood information system. So that system runs a hydrologic model and a hydraulic model every 6 hours, and develops forecasts of inundation extent for the next 9 days. So that's running in real time and producing those products that are available in the Missouri River flood information system. Recently, the Iowa Flood Center joined a $360 million NOAA Cooperative Institute for Research to Operations in Hydrology. So that was also known as CAIRO. Will receive up to $21 million over the next 5 years, and we are kind of a key partner in that group. And we're contributing our expertise in flood mapping, flood forecasting, water quantity and quality monitoring, hydroinformatics, and of course, all of our great outreach programs. And that program is being administered by the Alabama Water Institute at the University of Alabama. We really feel, a lot of our work through the Iowa Flood Center and other projects are why, we're a significant partner in that. We, look forward to helping provide some of these tools and research to, help water prediction for the rest of the nation. That, I think we're done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Brianna. Let's see, we have one question so far in the chat, so we can start with that one. It says, thank you, Daniel. I'm wondering if any of the modeled watershed scenarios looked at increasing organic content to soils and that impact on hydrology.
So we didn't specifically have model scenarios looking at just that kind of component. I guess as a hydrologic modeler, I think of increasing organic content as the allowing the soil to hold more water, infiltrate more. So kind of that parameterization was incorporated in those conversions of ag land to perennial vegetation, and then also the use of cover crops and no-till farming. But we didn't consider that specific model change.
Well, I have a couple of questions if, yeah, I'll yield to others if they come in. But one question I have is, have you all experienced, like in kind of general public or community settings where your research results or products are like causing, I guess, tension within the community around like solutions or interventions or things like that? Like I'm imagining like some community groups want a pond or a levee, or and then some segments of that get left out, or it's not the solution they want, or I don't know, just things like that. Like how does that get navigated in terms of like trying to provide a sort of evidence-based approach, but it doesn't necessarily mesh with maybe certain segments of like a community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So I might kind of talk about as part of what I do in the Iowa Flood Center activities, we provide technical assistance to small rural communities. A lot of these small Iowa communities don't have resources or engineers on staff to kind of look into things like, adding a pond, or in a lot of instances, there's, in these communities, they'll experience a flood, and then things like, the bridge, the county bridge at this location is why we had a flood. There's certain things within their community that kind of get pinpointed, and people say, if we remove that bridge or put in a wider bridge, we wouldn't have had a flood. So we try to provide kind of science and model-based investigations anyway, or assistance, to help them kind of see what projects would provide differences in, flooding impacts. We work very closely and have good relationships with a lot of our state agencies. So we need to be delicate, if they're pointing at a certain county bridge or DOT bridge, we don't want to say, this is why you're flooding, but if the modeling says that, then, that's what we communicate.
Great. Well, we are a bit at time, but if y'all can stay, there's a couple more questions if you want to answer any more of them.
Yeah, I could
Um,
take the next one, maybe about the outreach program and the process to construct the 700 projects. Dan had mentioned that one of the key elements of the IWA program was that we had project coordinators that really served as that boots on the ground person that was communicating with the Watershed Management Authority group. And then they were using our information and going out and working with different landowners to provide them with options for different flood mitigation projects that they could construct on their property. We actually had more people that were interested in this program than we had funding available. So there was lots of good interest from private landowners that wanted to have projects on their properties. So a lot of the projects were helping improve the accessibility of their farm operations, improving farm management activities for them, and also just kind of really wanting to leave that legacy piece for the next generation too. So a lot of them just recognizing that if I put in these projects, I'm going to help my community and my neighbors that live downstream from me too. So there was good success with that.
Yeah, it looks like there's one more question about exploring scenarios where creeks have small check dams to slow the water and allow better ground percolation and natural vegetation absorption. Um, so we had looked into kind of different grass waterway scenarios and increasing, I guess, roughness along some of the creeks. The specific scenario about having check dams and allowing for more percolation, that's kind of at a really fine scale that we didn't construct our model to look at. So if we were going to do that, it would have to be, really small drainage areas where we would make those models. And that's not something we did, but that's an interesting thing to look at, is looking at it at that scale.
Dan, do you want to mention the on-road structures work? Okay.
Uh, yeah. So let's see, was it Fayette County? Yeah,
Mhm.
so part of the work, the Iowa Shed Approach project in Fayette County, they had kind of developed a county ordinance that allowed them to, at certain locations where a culvert got washed out, um, they could kind of raise the roadway embankment and then also construct a two-stage inlet on one side. So it'd be like using the roadway structure as a dam, and then the inlet structure would kind of allow low flows through, but at higher flows, it would throttle those down. So it was really, um, in locations where culverts had washed out, it would help prevent that, and it would provide peak flow reductions downstream. So that's pretty innovative way about thinking of things. So we've since had another project, an offshoot of the Iowa Watershed Approach project called On-Road Structures Program, where I think it's statewide, right, Bree?
Mhm.
Yeah, so some of the researchers um, here at the Flood Center and then also at Iowa State looked into, you know, potential locations where these on-road structures could be constructed across the state. So we have a database available. Bree has just posted a link to that in the chat. So you can zoom into any of these roadway crossings where waterway goes through. And I think we've calculated in some of these locations kind of potential design considerations for those on-road structures. And that's something we would like to incorporate when we do these watershed models in the future, is to make use of that on-road structures database. So we could just kind of use that as an input and say, let's do on-road structures at all these locations within the watershed. What sort of impact would that have?
Great, thank you. Gosh, I did have one more like kind of broad question to maybe close out, if that's okay.
Sure.
Um, I was wondering, since I mean, we all live in watersheds, that are nested within bigger watersheds, um, and we don't have good, I guess, like our like political boundaries don't facilitate that very well. And so I'm wondering, like, I guess like how your work, like, have you noticed like a shift in like having a sort of watershed mentality, like within policymaking or general public spaces, like through your work, and like the sort of impact of that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that's one of the things that we say with our outreach program is that we're really trying to improve and enhance the watershed literacy across the state. So that's what we're always trying to do when we're working with either students or the public and just getting people to understand being a part of that watershed community. And when you go to a lot of our online tools like IFAS or the On-Road Structures platform or other systems that we've developed, we do try to put things into a watershed context so that as you're clicking around and looking at things, you automatically see those watershed boundaries delineated so that people can start to understand kind of rainfall that falls up here, how that's going to, go downstream and end up impacting me or my community in some way. But again, I also, mentioned the caveat that, positions and people are always changing. And so there's just always that need for constant outreach and education. One of the things that we're kind of getting started with some of the work that I do is we have a new staff member who has more of an education background. And so she's working on developing more curriculum that hopefully we can share with different science educators and curriculum developers across the state so that it's not just our team that's having to get out there, but so we have some other opportunities and more options to kind of share the work that we do.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you all so much for the really enlightening presentation. And thanks. Yeah, it was really wonderful to see like this sort of long-term project that really provides really tangible outcomes and benefits for folks. So yeah, I just really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much. And if people have any questions for either Dan or us, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, we will send out the slides and the link and the recording to all the folks who registered. And yeah, thanks again.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Right. Bye.
Bye.